Welcome to broadcast A of the fifth broadcast of the t-roh show. What we're doing is we're going back and looking at some of the older broadcasts of the t-roh and going into greater detail in each one. Uh, we thought it would be good to do that because some people, we move pretty fast. So we just want to kind of slow it down and start focusing on certain things that were lost. Let's put it that way in these broadcasts. So the fifth broadcast was dealing with the driver's license and intangible property, and many people were having issues with that, with the motions and all that kind of thing. And what we came up with was a motion to dismiss based on intangible property. We wanted to bring you up to date on what actually has been going on with this. It says in the narrative, the defendant went to the Department of Motor Vehicles to obtain a driver's license. The Department of Motor Vehicles failed to produce a form that would grant the defendant's intangible property to the use of the public highways to the Department of Motor Vehicles. Okay, so in order for a license to be issued and actually to legally exist on paper, you have to have property that's transferred to the licensor, and then it's the license back to the licensee. I believe I have that correct. And in order to prove intent, says the aforementioned grant would produce a valid contract of terms and conditions under the license that a defendant would sign in order for the prosecution to prove intent to violate the statute that the defendant is being accused of knowingly, willfully, intentionally violating. Well, there was one case that we were listening to, and one woman judge, she comes in and says, well, that's not the issue here. That's not the issue. It's whether you had a license. So they keep, according to the traffickers, they have to hide this. So another one was a prosecutor said, well, he says no license exists, but we have it on record here that a license exists. That's completely jumping over the threshold of truth and moving into fiction, because the license may exist or may have existed on paper, in other words, on their records, but it doesn't legally exist. In other words, it was never legally created. And the individual that was doing it, he didn't really understand too much about how to argue it. So they just went on and, they ignored it and all that, because that's what traffickers do. If you had a real judge, a real prosecutor, and a real lawyer sitting there, they would have stopped immediately and said, well, you're right. We've got to fix this. But you don't have real lawyers and all that. All they're interested in, traffickers are interested in making money. That's it. So that's all they care about. So if I'll do some refresher course here as far as people not if they understood what we were talking about. I'll go into here. It says public highway. Okay. Now includes every way, lane, road, street, boulevard, and every way the place in the state open as a matter of right to public vehicular travel, both inside and outside the limits of cities and towns. Okay, now when they put in the word as a matter of right, okay, that is intangible property. That's what they're talking about. You have intangible property to that right. You don't necessarily possess the right, it's a public right, but you have intangible property to the right. We've got a couple of them here also. Let me see what we got here. Here's the same thing. The entire width between the boundary lines. I'll show you this one in a minute. Here it is again. And is open to the use of the public as a matter of right for vehicular travel. It's right here. This means the entire width between property lines in every way or place of any nature when any part of it is open to the use of the public as a matter of right for vehicular travel. I'll bring this one up over here. It's the same exact thing. Now look at what Florida did. Means the entire width between the boundary lines of the way or place of if any part of that way or place is open to the public use for the purpose of vehicular travel. They took out the word as a matter of right. What's population, John?
It's between 18 and 19 million.
Okay, so that's 18.5 million counts of slavery in Florida. We'll tell you why. You have, once that right is removed from their statutes, I did forget to introduce myself, didn't I? I just went right to it. This is your host, Keith. Sorry, I got John on the line. I forgot all about that. I was concentrating on what I was trying to do here.
That's what happens when you get excited.
Yeah. So what they were doing was, what Florida did is, we said 18.5 million or so counts of slavery. That's also, folks, 18.5 million counts of destruction of private property. Every single time a trafficker ignores the intangible property rights of the people, that's destruction of private property. Intangible property is just as important as the property itself. And in the 5th broadcast, we talked about that. When you come out of the store, to give you an example of that, you're looking for your car. Now, what happens if you open somebody else's car, get in it, and take off? Now you're a car thief because you violated the private property, the private intangible property of the owner of that car. That's what defines theft and no theft. Do you have, then that's what they call it, do you have a legal right to drive the car? Do you have the intangible property right to drive that particular car? It's the very definition of stealing. That's how you prove intent. And like I said, you don't have many good lawyers out here. Actually, you don't have any lawyers at all, because any lawyer that sees this, real lawyer that sees this, he would start going right away and changing the laws, changing the way they do things and everything else. But instead, you have traffickers. Those traffickers are not gonna change anything. They're just going to keep going because they're waiting for the money. And that's what traffickers do. And if you're wondering, if you're hearing this for the first time and I keep talking about traffickers, you need to go to broadcast A of the 52nd broadcast, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So their state means a state or possession of the United States, and for the purpose of this chapter includes the District of Columbia. That is right there a definition and or admission that you've been trafficked. Just with that definition there. So once they did this, you're talking about destruction of private property. So the so-called licenses you have now are not valid IDs because it took to destroy private property in order to obtain them. Every ticket, every case, every this, every that. Okay, and it's right here. Use of the public as a matter of right. That's the intangible property right there. That intangible property right is destroyed. That's destruction of private property. Every individual or every man, woman over the age of 18 has this private property with them. That's what allows them to go anywhere they want to go. But if you've been trafficked, you're going to be under what they call slavery. That's the destruction of private property. That's destruction of the intangible property right to a home, to a job, and all those things. That's what slavery is. That's why it's legally wrong. You can't do that and actually survive. That's the destruction of a world. That's destruction of a country. That's destruction of everything. When the state embarks upon the destruction of private property in order to get its way and to collect revenue, it's no longer a state. Because real states don't do that. They write laws that make sure that private property is protected, not destroy it. Okay? So what is it in the minds of the people, of the traffickers? Why are they doing this, and why do they do this? Okay? Number one, it's pure ego. And we'll go right here. Okay? Just as an example. This is dealing with state troopers. Anybody, a lot of people don't even know why state troopers even came around. Why do they have a state police force? What the hell's going on? So since these troopers are organized on the state level, it started in New York, of course, the communist capital of the world there, the world communist government. They are essentially a governor's police force with the main responsibilities to protect high-ranking officials and state property. Now, this particular website on how stuff works added in rural areas that don't have local police departments, but I don't think there's actually any of those around. But they threw that on there. That was to get it in the minds of the people that they could actually step outside of the capital of a state. They're supposed to be, this is what state troopers are originally supposed to do. All they're really supposed to do is patrol the state capital. That's it. That's as far as they can go. Go back, look it up. That's what they're for. They protect the legislature. They have their own police force. You pay for that, by the way. And they protect state property. And that would be the capital. The public highways are not state property. That's for the use of the public as a matter of right. So you pay for that with your gas tax. You pay for the upkeep and all that. And that's how it works. So, but traffickers, okay, they don't think of it that way. What they do is this way. When the Nazis came into power in January 1933, right at the same time that Roosevelt came into power, actually 4 months later, Roosevelt made his little proclamation. Many policemen remained skeptical of the party and its intentions. Nazi agitation, especially in the latter years of the Weimar Republic, excuse my pronunciations of these things, had been subversive, that the police had been investigating both the Nazi and the communists with vigor. Nevertheless, Hitler posed a champion of law and order. Posed as, okay, claiming he would uphold traditional German values. The police and many other conservatives look forward to the extension of police power promised by a strong centralized state. Welcomed the end of factional politics and agreed to end democracy. So the Nazi state, in fact, alleviated many of its frustrations, the police experienced in the Republic. The Nazis shielded the police from public criticism by censoring the press. They ended street fighting by eliminating the communist threat. Police manpower was even extended by the incorporation of Nazi paramilitary organizations as auxiliary policemen. The Nazis centralized and fully funded the police to better combat criminal gangs and promote state security. The Nazi state increased staff and training and modernized police equipment. The Nazis offered the police broadest latitude in arrest, incarceration, and the treatment of prisoners. The police moved to take prevention action, that is, to make arrest without the evidence required for a conviction in court, and indeed without court supervision at all. Does any of that sound familiar, folks? Just wondering. Conservative policemen were initially satisfied with the results, their cooperation with the Nazi state. of their cooperation, Nazi state. Crime did indeed go down and the operation of criminal gangs ended. Now, let me show you what's actually happening. The crime gangs were actually created by the Nazis. They're the ones that started it. So they created the problem and then they fixed it and took credit for it. Order was restored, but there was a price. The Nazi state was not a restoration of the imperial tradition. It was at its core thoroughly racist. Now they put racism in there. And that's what's going on today. The Nazis took control and transformed the traditional police forces of the Republic into an instrument of state repression and eventually of genocide. The Nazi state fused the police with the SS and the security service, two of the most radical and ideologically committed Nazi organizations. Himmler, head of the SS, also became the chief of all police German forces. His associate, Heydrich of SD, became at the same time the head of the security police, charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime. They were charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime. Main responsibilities to protect high-ranking officials and state property. They became head of the security police charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime.
That now sounds somewhat like Homeland Security.
Main responsibilities to protect high-ranking officials' state property. Became the same time head of the security police charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime. Let's see that again, John. Are essentially the governor's police force with the main responsibility to protect high-ranking officials and state property. They became at the same time the head of the security police charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime. Nazi ideology became a part of all police activities. Could anybody say SPLC?
SPLC and Homeland Security.
Mm-hmm.
Also here in Florida would be FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
Yep.
Works directly for the governor.
The police were central figures, not just in maintaining public order, but in combating the so-called radical enemies designated by the Nazi state. It sounds like a hate group trying to come out with a hate group, SPLC. They were central figures. How much crap do you guys put on the police right today? Not just in maintaining public order, but in combating the so-called radical enemies designated by the Nazi state. It was in this context that preventive police action took on such terrible consequences. The SS, SD, and police were primary perpetrators of the Holocaust. Can anyone say FEMA camps? I did like to say that one more time, though. At the same time, head of the security police charged with safeguarding the Nazi regime. Essentially, a governor's police force with the main responsibility to protect high-ranking officials and state property. Now, how many state troopers even know that? Those guys are all over the freaking place, constantly. And they work directly for the governor. They don't answer to anybody else. They don't answer to the state legislature. They don't answer to anybody but the governor himself. That's a private police force, folks. It's been going on for the last 50 years, but people just don't, it's been going on so slowly that you just didn't see it coming. Okay, the same exact thing happened here, and they were the primary perpetrators of the Holocaust. The exact same thing. Now, I'm not saying all state troopers are SS or that they're even aware of it, but they should be aware of it now on what they actually are. Like I said, you have to get past the veil. You have to get past the play. They're just a private police force for governors. You have 50 of them, 50 governors with their own private police force, and upwards of 1,000 troopers that a governor can dispatch anytime he wants. Doesn't matter. And they're used in combating the radical racial enemies designated by the Nazi Party. So they traffic you offshore, then set in their Nazi state. That's what happened. And that's what everybody's living in now. And it's been going on for quite a while. They're getting you used to it. And they're slowly conditioning people to it. Now, this right here, okay, this is step one. Now the rest of the states will fall in line. Remove as a matter of right. As a matter of right. Remove that. They'll remove it. And what they'll do is say includes every way, lane, road, street, boulevard, and every way, place in the state open to public vehicular travel, both in and outside the limits of the cities and towns. And take out as a matter of right. It's just a matter of time for them to do it. Florida has already done it. So what happens when you take the intangible property right of somebody away, but you cause them to support it without pay? Support something without pay. That's slavery. There's no way around that. And that's where the country's headed. So what we're talking about is destruction of private property in all of its forms. So if you do a motion like we were talking about, and we had the link on number 5 at the bottom, when you're doing these motions, a motion to dismiss or something of that nature, it was just a basic motion, is all it is. You're saying that it cannot legally exist and therefore cannot exist a controversy before the court. There is no controversy. But a trafficker will try to create that controversy so he can get the money. That's what traffickers do. Real lawyers don't do that. Real prosecutors don't do that. Real policemen don't do that. Real judges do not do that. Real legislatures do not do what they're doing. And real governors don't do what they're doing here. Real governors don't have their own little police force. Their own private police force that you support because they get paid out of the treasury. It's misallocation of public funds, felony. But, they're traffickers, so what difference does it make to them? So people are out there saying they want to give up their intangible property right to a gun. So you have a bunch of people trying to destroy private property. It's become a mob. And all they're doing is destroying private property. And their own at the same time. So all these people that are saying, we got to get rid of the guns, we got to get rid of the guns, they're destroying private property right in front of you. You just didn't realize that's what they're doing. They're trying to use every way they can possibly use to get you to agree to destroy your own private property.
Isn't that the same thing they did when they changed the city charters and to appoint or elect their own officers?
Yeah.
That took your intangible property of right to vote and enslaved the population of the city.
That was a destruction of private property.
That's correct.
Actually, in the town that you're talking about, that was 1,100 counts.
Yes, sir. Look at New York. That'd be 8 million count.
Right. So if the state does not have the right to take private property without just compensation, it is legally impossible for a department of the same state or different state to claim a right that does not exist. No one has the right to take or destroy private property. Intangible property is the same as intangible property. They're both the same, and they both have the same standing in any court, a real court, not a trafficker's court. If you had a real judge and a real attorney, you wouldn't even be there. If you had a real police officer, he wouldn't even think twice about doing what he's doing. He would stop it immediately. He'd say, no, not going to have this. I only heard of one real police officer. He was on the force 36 years. And he pulled this guy over that was driving. He was driving on the job. He was a delivery guy up there. I think he's in New York. And he pulled him over, and he knew him. He knew he was having trouble with his wife. He knew he was going to counseling. He knew all this stuff. This guy had a bad day. He was a little drunk. So he pulled him over, and he said, look, he said, I'm not going to bust you. He said, what I'm going to do, though, is you're going to give me the keys. You're going to go home and walk it off. He says, I know, because if you'd have busted him, he would have just completely destroyed the man's family. And he knows he's going through a lot of problems. And some people do stupid things, like drink when they're going through problems. So he just stopped him and then gave him a lecture, and the guy never did it again. But that was a real cop. He didn't play, he didn't have to call in all the time. What do I do? What do I do? I don't know what to do, But the country is definitely in need of real police, real lawyers, and real judges. What you got now, folks, is a fake. It's all crap. They're international traffickers just playing international games, going around destroying as much private property as they can possibly destroy. The more private property they destroy, the more people they can enslave and get more money from and sit on their butts. It's called socialism on steroids. Now, once the people lose all their money, nobody has anything to take, then they start the killing because they have no more use for you. That's what happened in Germany. They had no more use for the people that they stole all this property from, stole their intangible property rights and stole their property to support their party. And when they did that, they opened up in the camps, and that's what FEMA camps are for. When you guys finally run out of everything, where do you guys think that thousands of homeless disappeared to? In Utah. All of a sudden, the homeless were all gone one day. Nobody said a word. Once they have nothing to take, they throw them in a camp or kill them. That's how this works. Or they sell their body parts. They can take that. They can take the body parts and sell those. So that's what they do. Happens in China. Happens in China all the time. There was a boat that was caught, had body parts all in it, going to China. Body parts of Americans. That's how sick all this stuff is. These were some very sick people, very sick scientists that were brought over from Germany that were employed by, you know who, Manhattan Island. So if they have no problem destroying private property, then why are you writing a bunch of paperwork? The only thing you can do is claim you've been trafficked, and that's it. And all those that said that, only certain people were Europeans, well, guess what? All of you were trafficked. Everyone's person's been trafficked. All your private property was destroyed. So guess what? Everybody's in the same boat, no matter who you are. Doesn't matter who you are. unless you come through the United States of America, declare residency, and deliver it back to the States. Then all those rights are destroyed. And don't think that your life is going to change overnight. You still have more people to bring in. So you need to turn around and help that. Help bring those people in, your fellow Americans that would be Americans if they weren't trafficked. Bring them into the States of the Union. And y'all have to start sticking together and helping each other, because no one is helping you. The result is they're going to take everything you have, and once you have nothing, then they take what body parts they want or they can sell. That's what traffickers do. So we brought this up. That was last year. The intangible property issue. We brought it up. Not one judge gave us a call. Not one lawyer. Not one policeman. Nobody said a word. They just moved on as if nothing was happening. They knew it had merit. They knew it had standing. And they did nothing about it. What they did was, other than destroy private property for another year. That's what really happened. So what's happened? You have traffickers that pose as all kinds of things. Private organizations, non-governmental organizations, everything you can possibly imagine that have hijacked your public highways. Those public highways belong to the public. And what do they tell, not the lawyers, but the traffickers tell the other traffickers to say? No, driving is a privilege. Driving is a privilege. You have to conform. Driving is a privilege. They always say that. But we've shown you how it is actually a matter of right. And you can get a license to drive or for the use of the public highways. But there has to be something that's given and taken. Okay, intangible property can be given to a Department of Transportation and then monetized for bonds and things like that to cover your actions and damages. It doesn't have to cost you a dime. It's your intangible property right. That's what we do. That's the result of the government of the United States of America. That's what we decided to get done. And it works very well. Actually, the people that thought that they would never get a driver's license ever, we get bugged constantly for people. Hey, can I get my bond signed? Can I get this signed? It's constant. Beating down the doors to get one. Because it's done correctly. People don't mind having licenses. They don't care. As long as it's done right and there's a fair trade there, they have no issues with it. Not even your hardcore, I'll never get a license, I have a right to travel, and all those, even those guys. Because that's the actual argument. The argument over this is the intangible property rights, not I have a right to travel. Yes, I have a right to travel describes an intangible property right, but you're not addressing the issue. And those motions are still on there. And a trafficker's court and a Masonic lodge will do what they're doing because that's how they are. That's I'm going to try to find this one thing I wanted to show people. Okay. There it is, I think. Okay. You'll see a lot of Masonic symbols on court buildings is what I'm trying to say. You'll see it all over the place. If you just look, just go to the internet and look up Masonic symbols, the Freemasonry and everything else. And that's a private building. There's nothing more you can say about that. Okay. And you just go look. I can't, they're not coming up right now. They're just, it's just coming up, just the buildings themselves. If I can find something, I'll show you. But at any rate, keep in mind the intangible properties. Keep in mind theft or destruction of private property. You got to be very careful about that, because a lot of people don't realize that when your intangible property right is destroyed like that, when it's recognized by 48, 50 states, and it's done that way by the courts, you're not dealing with a court, you're dealing with traffickers. And you need to get back to your real judges, real prosecutors, and there actually are real lawyers that are non-bar that don't put up with this stuff. They fight for the rights for protecting the private property of the people. So they're literally trying to stop legal ID cards. Now, why would they try to stop legal ID cards? By acknowledging your private property as their intangible property. Why would they stop doing that? Because if you want the state to identify you, you have the intangible property right to identity. So you have to transfer that intangible property right to that state, and then they become your second witness. Yes, I'm the agent that holds his intangible property right to his identity. I'm the agent, meaning the state, that holds your intangible property right to your identity. And yes, they are who they say they are. They become a second witness. But if the state doesn't have your intangible property right to your identity, how can the state identify you? They can't. So what do you have? You have no legal identity. There's no legal ID card that you can get from a state that does not ask for the intangible property right to your identity to hold for you and issue a card. There is your other evidence of trafficking. You're a trafficked person and stateless. And if your person's been trafficked offshore and then brought back here, you're never given any identity. Did you transfer? Everybody keeps asking these questions, but I don't think they really understand what kind of questions they're asking. Can I still get a U.S. passport? There is no such legal thing as a U.S. passport. There is no such thing, because you didn't transfer your intangible property right to go to and from or leave a country and come back to the agency that issues the passports. They're holding your identity for you, so when you travel overseas, that identity can't be stolen by someone else. That's called security. That's what they call a legal passport. A passport that does not ask for the intangible property to your identity or to your right to travel to and from a country, away from your country, out of your country, and back in. If they don't ask for that, they destroyed private property.
Isn't that exactly what happened when they issued you a birth certificate? They took all your intangible property at that point and shipped it out of country.
Right. They hijacked all of your God-given rights.
That's correct. And then they put their social security number on top of that and brought you back over here for taxation purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Because they had already taken all your intangible property. Therefore, you have no argument about what they do with you. Go ahead, Keith.
Okay, and so you have so people think that a U.S. passport, well, it's a privilege. You know, they always say it's a privilege. No, it's destruction of private property. Is what it is. You have to identify exactly what it is before you go off half-cocked and and say, well, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that, blah 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 blah, because you have to really understand what you're doing. Okay, so I'll go over this one more time, then we'll go ahead and end this particular broadcast. If a state says, okay, or do you have a homeland security? Do you have a homeland security identification? Google asked for that. Facebook asked for it, or actually Twitter asked for it. A lot of these other places asked for it. Do you have a homeland security identification? Well, did Homeland Security ask for your intangible property right to your identity before they wanted to require you to have one of their IDs? Or they had the authority to require you to have one of your IDs? So what they did was they put out an order. They didn't actually fulfill that order or think that all the way through, because Nazis normally don't do that, and traffickers don't do that. They don't think things through. Of, well, can we legally do that? Because they're already doing illegal stuff. So legal doesn't really even come into mind. Lawful doesn't come to mind. It's orders and let's just get this done the quickest way they possibly can. Because the IDs make them money. They want to sell the ID. So they're going to sell you your identity, your intangible property right to your identity to you, without actually accepting the intangible property right to your identity to sell it back to you. They sold you thin air. They sold you blue sky, man. They don't have anything. They're not selling you anything. They charge what, 120 bucks or 150 bucks for a passport? There's no agreement on the intangible property right to your right to leave the country and come back. So what was the charge for? They sold you something that they didn't have, that doesn't exist. That's how they operate. That's how traffickers operate. That's how people that do not think in law, they don't think lawfully or even legally, because believe it or not, there's a lot of people that don't understand. Legal is in international law. It's always been that way. The Bar Association doesn't have the right to hijack the word legal. Okay, they don't have that right, or any other language at all. Just like the FDA cannot hijack the word cure. It's just ridiculous. Did anybody ever hand their intangible property right to the welfare and health of your body to the FDA? Do you transfer it over to a doctor? Does anybody transfer anything anymore? Or do they just destroy the private property altogether and play like it doesn't exist?
Isn't that what Trump did up there when he said, we'll take it now, we'll worry about due process later?
Mm-hmm.
He just took your intangible property.
He just destroyed private property of everybody.
That's right. And he's not even going to worry about due process in the courts until a later date. And
yeah, we'll worry about that later,
Yeah, he didn't even say when they might do it, just later.
So okay, so one kid or whatever does one thing he shouldn't have been doing, and now everybody else is punished. Everybody else is tried, convicted, and sentenced. And for some reason, the death of those students requires the destruction of everybody's private property. How are you safe in a situation like that? How does that make you safe? Don't understand that. But all I've been witnessing, for the past 7 years, is the slow destruction of private property everywhere.
Yes, and that could also be called being convicted before the fact.
Exactly. So everybody was being tried for the last week. That's why everybody's kind of feeling weird. You're being convicted, and they're waiting to sentence you. That's what criminals do. They don't worry about due process and all that. That just takes too long. We don't have time for that. Let's destroy the private property now. That's what they do. That's what traffickers do. That's what people that do not think, or they think outside the law. They're used to breaking the law all the time. Why would they start following it now? And this is property you can't see. You can't touch, you can't feel, but it's there. It's just as important as tangible property. Intangible property to a vehicle is just as important as the vehicle, being the tangible property, something you can touch, which means you have a right to get in it because you own it. You have a right to use it because you own it. There's two sets of properties when it comes to vehicles. Then we get the lecture, and this was another judge. I forgot to tell you about this. He starts lecturing the guy on, well, you know, if you were out there on a horse and buggy, that'd be different. If you were out there on moped, that's different. But when it comes to motor vehicles, we have a right to destroy your private property. That's basically what he said. We have a right to destroy that. He didn't say that word for word, but essentially that's what he did. He said, we have the right to regulate and license those vehicles and all this other use of those vehicles and all that stuff. Oh, so you have a right to destroy private property. Okay. So you're claiming a right doesn't exist. No one has the right to destroy somebody else's private property. So why is it that if you wear a black robe, it's okay to do that? It's because that's the play. You're not seeing behind the scenes. You're not seeing what the man's really doing, or the woman. You're seeing something completely different. And they try to discuss it, and they try to do all these things. Oh, yes, we have jurisdiction. We have jurisdiction to destroy your private property. We have jurisdiction to do this. We have jurisdiction to do that. They're claiming rights they don't have. That's how it operates. That's how the Nazi Party operated. And that's how the traffickers today operate. That's how the Masons operate. That's how the the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre operate. That's how the Vatican operates. That's how the Crown operates. That's how Washington, D.C. operates. They try you, convict you, and sentence you. And you're sitting there going, how did that happen? And if you were starting to look at intangible property and intangible property rights, that's how they did it. They did it by destroying something that you can't see, touch, feel, hear, that you're not aware that it exists, but you use it every day. How many people have said, well, I went to sleep tonight, I went in my bed. Well, how do you know it's your bed? How do we know that you own that bed? By customary use and intangible property right to the bed. You said, well, I bought the bed. Okay, so you bought the intangible property right to the bed. That's your bed. You use it every day. How do you know if those are your dishes? How do you know if that's your lawnmower? How do we know that that's your car? Everybody just automatically gets it, but they don't know how to explain it. And that's what this particular broadcast is about, explaining what intangible property right is, even though you can't touch it, see it, feel it, hear it. I mean, people say, I use my computer today. Well, how do I know that that's your computer? You're exercising your intangible property right to it. There's an assumption there that you own it. And unless somebody else says otherwise, you own the computer, or you own this, or you own that. And if they can prove that you never owned it, guess what? You were exercising your intangible property right to the use of tangible property that you didn't have the exclusive right to use. Their intangible property right to that tangible property overrides yours. And that's the very definition of theft. But if you completely ignore it in any transaction, in any time, intangible property right to anything, you've destroyed private property or private property. So hopefully this broadcast gives you a little bit more understanding of intangible property. We did deal with it in just trafficking. I'm sorry, traffic cases and things like that. But it sounds okay on this program. In reality, they will probably keep destroying private property until someone stands up and claims that individual, I don't know who he is, but he's definitely not a real judge or not a real prosecutor, because real prosecutors and real judges do not destroy private property. Real lawyers don't. Real policemen don't. It's whoever these guys are. Whether you call them traffickers, whether they follow the Nazi regime, whatever they do, if they're communist, socialist, or whatever it is. That's why communists are extremely dangerous. That's why socialism is extremely dangerous. It destroys private property. And that's what the term is. Well, you're punishing the law-abiding citizen, somebody who recognizes intangible property rights of others. You're trying and convicting them and destroying their private property. Happens all the time. And that's when you've lost your country. You've lost everything. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that's what happens. So at any rate, thank you for listening to broadcast A of the 5th broadcast of the T-Roh Show. We'll try to keep doing this on other broadcasts that we've done and go into more detail and explain a little bit further. So thanks for listening. This has been your host, Keith, and John was with me today. And we will talk to you soon. See you later.